All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for giving us a couple minutes to get started. Out of respect for everyone's time, appreciate you joining, and we want to kick off today's event. We are excited to have that you have dedicated some time today to hear about safety measures and enabling confidence in the workplace once businesses start returning to offices and bringing staff back. And we are seeing our safer at home orders being lifted. My name is Jennifer Chambers. I am a partner at Plant Moran in our real estate and construction practice, and I'm pleased to be serving Crew Detroit as the 2020 president. Before we introduce our moderator and speakers for today's event, I wanted to just provide you an update on Crew Detroit's upcoming events. Our organization has remained committed to providing value to our members and to the commercial real estate community. Our committees have been hard at work to redevelop programs to adapt to our new reality, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their efforts. In the coming months, we have a number of exciting things planned. Next week, on June 18th and 19th, Crew Network is offering a virtual leadership summit, which is a complimentary event for all Crew members to provide opportunities to hear about what's going on in the industry and to grow their leadership skills. Next month, on July 7th, we are excited to welcome back Ari Weinsweg, the founder of Zingerman's. Ari spoke with us last fall and was a tremendous event, and he will be coming back for a virtual event on July 7th on inspiring hope in the workplace. And this will be available to members and non-members. In the coming months, we will be hosting a combination of in-person and virtual events, including golf opportunities, an outdoor summer gathering, and a reimagined awards event. We invite you to stay connected to us through our e-blasts, social media, and our Crew Detroit website, which does have all of our upcoming events and is continuing to get updated. I want to take a minute to acknowledge our major annual sponsors for 2020. We very much appreciate their support. As you get to know organizations within the commercial real estate industry, please keep these quality organizations in mind as you think of opportunities. At the Marble level, we have JLL, Level 1 HVAC, Plant Moran, and Saxey Construction. And at the Granite level, we have AM Higley, HED, Horizon Bank, and Redico. At this time, I would like to introduce the moderator for today's event, and she will get us going on the program and introduce our speaker. Jennifer Thomas is a land development manager at MI Homes. She has been a member of Crew for about 7 years and currently serves on our board of directors. Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Jennifer Chambers for that introduction. I don't know if you can see me. It seems we're having a little bit of technical difficulties here, but we're working through them. So thank you guys for your patience. I am very excited to be introducing Sharon Netto-Lipsky with Haworth, who is going to be providing the speech today on the human element, safety culture in post-pandemic workplace.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sharon. We got you on the line finally.
Yes.
So everyone, thank you for hanging on with us for just a moment. We're still experiencing a little bit of a difficulty in getting Sharon's slides up to the screen, but Sharon, we are very excited to have you here to present on the human element of safety and culture in the post-pandemic workplace. If you want, you could get started and we will work on getting those slides up here, but just go ahead and kind of get started. And for those of you that are on the line watching, this is a presentation and then all questions will be answered at the end. If you have any, we are having a Q&A session. So please make sure to send your questions in through the Q&A box and we will be sure to get Sharon to answer those at the end of this great presentation. So Sharon, take it away.
Thank you so much. And just for the host, I think I have been disabled and I can't share my screen. So you'll have to allow me to share my screen. I apologize.
Sharon, you should be all set now if you'd like to give that a try.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Well, I apologize, everyone, for the technical difficulties, but that's the reality of the world we live in today. And I thought it would be interesting, considering the audience that we have with the Crew Network. I wanted to show a picture from 1937, and this is the Golden Gate Bridge. And the analogy, I think, rings really true for us today. You know, in 1937, these gentlemen risked their lives basically on a catwalk and succumbed to high winds. And every single day they thought they were going to plummet into the water as they were putting cables up for the Golden Gate Bridge. And while, you know, we're not plummeting to our death in cold water, we certainly have a lot to deal with today as we go through a very interesting time in the history of our generation, I would say. But also, I wanted to say that it's not just about COVID, right? So if you think about it, today we're dealing with a number of different things. We're dealing with the pandemic. We're dealing with the notion of what it's going to look like for us post-pandemic, if there is such a thing as post-pandemic. We're dealing with climate change issues. We're dealing with conflict born by conscious and unconscious bias in our society. And we're dealing with a tanking economy as a result of all of this. And we might argue that while the pandemic is not singular, it is certainly something that we can either view as a catalyst or a disruptor. And so for the remainder of this presentation, I hope to just walk us through some key considerations as to, you know, how we think about safety and culture in the workplace, excuse me. So let me start by introducing a gentleman. This gentleman is named Abraham Maslow. And in the 40s, he came up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the theory, and it's a theory on human motivation. And essentially, when Maslow talked about our needs as a human being, he stacked it up in a pyramid. And I'm sure many of you have seen this. Well, the reality is, in order for us to meet our higher level needs, so the top part of the pyramid, some very basic needs have to be met. Things like food, water, shelter, security. These are some of the needs that we've had to struggle with in the time of COVID. And then there are the needs of belonging and social connectedness. And, you know, when we've been in shelter in place, we've gone through so many iterations of isolation. So as we think about this, we've got to think about the impact on the human being. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, internalize it. This is something that affects every single one of us on this call today. Then, as we shift into looking at the more macroeconomic environment, we're obviously operating in a VUCA world. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this term that was coined by the military, I believe, after the Second World War. And it was really about the fact that we are no longer linear problem solvers anymore. We are dealing with a confluence of a lot of different things coming at us at a very fast speed. So our environment is uncertain. The environment demands that we react quickly. How many of us on this call had to pivot very quickly over the last 8 weeks to redefine how we work and how we take charge of the tasks ahead of us? And we did this in a very uncertain environment, you know, from one executive order to the next. We were hanging on statistics and numbers, and there was complexity. There was a lot of fragmentation of the supply chain. And I'm sure we're also experiencing that in our own businesses. And then we're going into the ambiguous, you know, what is life after a pandemic? And is there in fact a post-pandemic? So as we think about all of this, I wanted to level set and make sure we contextualize that change was happening both at a macro level as well as at an individual level. And yet, as organizations think about re-entering, having their workforce re-enter, there are very important elements of engagement that will likely need to be redefined. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. At Haworth, we look at engagement, and we look at engagement in terms of whether our members, our employees, have a sense of meaning in their work. Do they have autonomy? Do they feel like they can grow? Do they feel like the work impacts others and that they feel a connection? Well, let's think about those engagement factors in the time of COVID. People have had to redefine meaning for themselves, whether it was at home or at work. They've lost autonomy. And while we might argue that, you know, hey, many people were working from home, a lot of the work they did from home was at the behest of how people how effectively people were collaborating in a virtual environment. Nothing was about growth. Everything was about reaction. And in terms of impact, because people were isolated, they weren't quite certain that they were making an impact. And so, and the last one, connectedness, is pretty clear. People didn't feel a sense of connectivity. And so as organizations look to bringing people back, they have to recognize that the people coming back into their workspaces are likely going to be very stressed. In some cases, they have been impacted by a loss of income. People have been furloughed. People have been put on lack of work status. They might have lost a loved one. And if they didn't, there's still a lot of confusion based on all of the media that's coming our way. There's a sense of helplessness, that they're not in control, and a sense of physical and social isolation. So all of these things, these are the things that your employees are going to start to feel as they have to come back and be productive in the workplace. So before we go any further, let's think about culture and the whole notion of culture in a post-pandemic world. So culture, and how we define it at Haworth, is based on three concentric circles that intersect, and they are the values of an organization and how it represents itself, some of the assumptions we make through the company processes and actions, and some of the artifacts that we have that a company uses to demonstrate their brand. And so when we think about culture, think about how your culture is going to shift when people start re-entering into the workplace. Their assumptions might change invariably. Definitely the artifacts will change as well in terms of how the people are going to be sitting on that floor plate, whether break rooms are going to be fully utilized. Are there going to be assumptions about camaraderie? So I think this is going to be something that many organizations are going to have to redefine and reinvent. And as we think about culture, we have to also recognize that culture is not homogeneous. Culture is different, and we have organizations that likely represent attributes that could fall into one of these 4 quadrants that you see on the slide. There are cultures where people like to create and innovate, and so their spaces require for them to come together and share information. There are cultures where they like to compete. You know, this might be a sales organization where they need touchdown spaces and they want to do things quickly. There are cultures in finance, as an example, or project management, where you want to do things right. And so there are systems and processes and artifacts within an organization that either help or hamper that. And then there are cultures like typical cultures in human resources, where it's highly collaborative and people want to do things that that last. So I wanted to give you the lens that we look at when we think about culture as we re-enter the workplace. Additionally, we also have to think about affordances and what we believe the workforce is going to require post-COVID, right? The whole notion of surfaces and touching surfaces and shared surfaces, how are people going to respond to that? And so when we look at it from a Haworth perspective, we look at it in 3 different buckets. Your space has to provide your ability to do your best work. We call that cognitive. It gives you the ability to think about how you support your corporal needs. So things like the ambience and movement within the space. And now we're saying to people, yes, welcome back to the workplace, but maybe we don't really want you to move around that much on the floor plate. And then the third is the emotional. You know, how are we representing and how is the organization manifesting care for its employees through things like well-being and affinity? When people can't come together by the water cooler anymore, how do they still stay connected? In a recent survey with Robert Half in Canada, they came up with some pretty interesting survey results. And it was fascinating to me that there were such a high percentage of people who are afraid to work in close physical proximity to their colleagues. And I say this not because I'm naive, but because there are some interesting attributes as a result of that. Is the workplace then going to be more virtual to allow for that? And if so, then, you know, scroll up to the last 3 slides, because then we have to start thinking about how culture looks like when we have a dispersed workforce that doesn't come together in one geographic region. And this was another interesting survey that the conference board conducted. And what was interesting was how much more balance we were going to see in people participating in remote work. So I think the one thing we can learn from this, and I think I saw this quote and I thought it was very interesting, because we can use this opportunity to learn from this disruption and rethink how the working environment for our people would look like in the future, as opposed to going back to our old ways. And so I wanted to just help you think through some of that. So what really has changed, right? Pre-COVID, we tried to balance a full-time job. We tried working out and, you know, playing the different roles that we do outside of work. And so what is going to be different when we finally go back to work? Oh yeah, maybe I might have a commute either way, and I'll have more freedom to go about my business. But the reality is, we have all been put into a forced situation um, with the shelter in place. And so we've acquired some new skills that we need to think about and celebrate. We've really thought about how we get focused work done despite distractions. All of a sudden, we've experienced much more commingling of the various spheres of our lives. And this is a competency that we bring back to the workforce and to the workplace, rather. We've also adopted to remote work technology, although my late entrance today might suggest that I haven't quite adopted it perfectly. But the reality is the people who shied away from using technology as a way to communicate were now being forced to think through different ways. Think about how we communicate even outside of a business context. Think about how we reach out to aging family members and to friends and relatives who are perhaps down the road from us. We've also become very adept at establishing expectations and setting boundaries. We're learning that there is going to be a continued commingling of expectations in the business. And so these are great competencies to bring back to the workplace. And we've learned discernment, you know, with homeschooling and working from home and the toilet paper crisis. We learned what we were good at, and we learned what we were not so good at as well. And those are great business competencies that employers will want to see coming back into the workplace. And finally, and I think most importantly, this has also taught us as a collective that empathy and compassion are significant and will be very important as we start to rebuild into this post-COVID world. And finally, you know, we've become adaptive. We've proven that we can work remotely. And I believe that our workforce will start demanding that if they haven't already. And I know as a human resource professional, we've already started to see that as a significant part of our employment branding is the ability to give people flexibility. So if companies have not already adopted that, this pandemic has demonstrated that we can all work remotely. And it might not be entirely effective, but that will be the journey in terms of culture building as we regroup. So I wanted to share very quickly an interesting slide that I was privy to seeing a couple of weeks ago. And this is from a company called 70 and Change, and you can check them out. But they have an interesting survey that you can use and you can send out to people in your organization that ask them specific questions about how they feel about the pandemic. And it then charts it in terms of disruptors in your personal life versus disruptors in your business life. And here we see a chart that really speaks to what happened when we went into shelter in place. It was initially very challenging. We didn't perhaps have the right equipment, the right internet connectivity, the right lighting to support our work, or perhaps we were also adjusting to homeschooling kids and sharing devices amongst kids. Then we started to get into our groove and started to figure out how to work in this shelter in place mode. We go through ups and downs, and now we've adapted and assimilated, and we're preparing to return to the workplace. Re-entry is going to be interesting because there are people who haven't seen each other. The workplace, as we have demonstrated, is no longer a place for accountability. Rather, it's a place for camaraderie, and people are going to be excited to see each other. And then we're going to go through this dip in productivity again, because people will start feeling like, hey, I was so much more productive when I worked at home. I perhaps do not need to come into the workplace. And so it's calling for organizations, leadership, and the human resources organization, as well as facilities managers, to think very critically about how our spaces are going to help us re-energize our workforce into this new reality. So this is a little bit about what we've been tasked to do as an organization, and our customers are asking for this in terms of employee well-being, organizational culture and how we maintain it, and how we transform the floor plate to allow for appropriate social distancing and yet accommodate collaboration. So there are a number of different organizational implications that we've been thinking through as we think about returning to the workplace. Things like how to determine occupancy. How do you determine whose work can get done remotely, and how do people interact with each other? So think about this in very plain terms. You have a meeting that you would like to set up for 20 people, but your meeting room can only accommodate 7 people, let's say, because of social distancing norms. And yet not everyone is going to be in that meeting room. So do the people in the meeting room actually pull up a Zoom platform or a Teams platform to then interact with those who are not in the room? So those are some of the considerations that we are challenged with, to think about how people are going to respond to this change. Cleanliness is obviously another significant area. This is, again, a manifestation of the company's care for their employees and what is important. Safety, and I know I'm preaching to the choir with this, this group, but the notion of safety and visual cues on how we stay safe remain important. Density, as I just illustrated, and then how are we going to interact and collaborate? And how do I feel a sense of autonomy in collaborating in the way that I want to collaborate? And finally, do we have the right technology platforms to allow for us to interact? And while organizations perhaps have a really intact technology platform to allow for people to collaborate and interact, the bubble doesn't extend to vendors, customers, and other stakeholders in the whole value chain. So these are some key considerations that I suspect many leaders will be grappling with. So I wanted to make sure then I left you with some things to ponder, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So as we think about re-entry, don't expect getting back to normal to be close to anything normal. There is no normal anymore, and we have to start to help people understand what this new reality looks like versus going back to the way it used to be. And if you think about normalcy, normalcy is not going to happen as soon as you scan your badge to enter your workplace. Normalcy will take likely 12 to 18 months. And there are a lot of different reasons for why that would happen. The economy being one of those things, as well as cost reduction initiatives. And then reboard your employees, even though they've been with you a long time, expectations have changed when people work from home. And so as they re-enter the workplace, it is wise and prudent to rethink about your team norms, your organizational norms, and how you choose to communicate. And I would also say, train your managers and supervisors to recognize, signs of trauma. People have been stressed during this time. Remember my previous slide about isolation and about feeling powerlessness. And so now we're asking them to produce or behave or be productive as an employee, and not understanding that there are still very imminent stresses outside of their work life. And I would also say, use this time to make sure that your leaders, your frontline to your people, are getting the right skills so that they can deal in this VUCA world. And while these are good, I think, re-entry business assumptions, there are things that we need to also assume from an employee perspective. Make sure they know that safety remains your number one priority, that and continue to speak about it and continue to demonstrate it. It's going to help people focus and refocus back on the work that needs to be done versus worrying about the person who's coughing, or I heard someone sneeze in the restroom before I entered it. So these are things that are sometimes irrational, but these are real fears. Manage the yearning for collaboration. The one thing that people say they want to do when they go back into the workplace is see their teammates. And so we have to manage it. We have to manage it in both directions. We have to temper it and be a little bit middle of the road, because there are going to be people who want to do the potluck parties and people who want to have the golf events. But on the other end of the spectrum, we want to ensure that we're also not discriminating against the folks who perhaps cannot, and discriminating likely is not a good word, but we're not disadvantaging the employees who perhaps do not have the ability to collaborate, or because of childcare needs, we are unintentionally being exclusive and not inclusive. And the third thing I would say is share information liberally. People want to understand what the business priorities are post-COVID. Are we going to an e-commerce model? Are we going to a low-touch, high-technology model? These are things that people want to know about in an organization. And, address the big distraction. I know that a lot of companies have already gone through reductions in force and have eliminated positions, and perhaps others who are holding off. But this is front of mind for many employees who want to go back into the workplace. Remember the saying, out of sight, out of mind, and being visible is really important. So if at all possible, talk about what the plans are in the event there was a contraction in business. And I would encourage everyone to think about starting re-engagement now. Don't wait till you're actually physically back in the office to be starting engagement initiatives. Now is the right time. If you understand what keeps someone engaged while they're working from home, you'll certainly have better insight into keeping them engaged when they re-enter to the workforce in the post-COVID world. And with that, I was just showing you an example of how my direct reports and I keep engaged in a post-COVID world. We do a weekly quarantini, and we have different themes, and it's allowed us to actually get to know each other a lot better than we would ever have in the workplace. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I will stop sharing my slides.
All right, thank you very much, Sharon. That was a great presentation. We've got a slew of questions to get started for the Q&A. And on behalf of Crew Detroit and everyone that participated, thank you again. And for those of you that are out there still watching, if you have any additional questions to send in, please send them in through the Q&A. We'll make sure that Sharon gets those answered. So to kick us off and get us started, We've got a few questions here in the queue for you already. So, Sharon, you mentioned that coming back to work could potentially be stressful for employees. What have you seen put in place in your own organization, or do you recommend that employers look to help, de-stress employees on their re-enter back to the workplace? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. That's a force of habit. That's a great question. So there are a number of different things that we're doing right now. And critical, and I would say at the top of that is frequent communication, two-way communication. So we put out information on updates for executive orders. We run global town hall meetings so that we can provide people with a state of the business, both from a business perspective and in the context of COVID and how it's in fact impacting all of our businesses. We've also been very responsive and quick to talk about people who've tested positive so that we've stayed transparent without breaking HIPAA regulations. But we've also done a lot of contact tracing. We've done a lot of communication and education around keeping each other safe. And we've also determined as an organization that re-entry was a phased exercise and continues to be a phased exercise. We are in phase 1 right now, where it's only people who support manufacturing in our instance, or us supporting the new product introduction process, who need to go into the office, into the workplace. But then we also make sure that they understand that in order for them to go into the workplace, they do have to wear a mask. They do have to self-certify. They do have to do all of the things that become those cultural artifacts that I spoke of to show that the organization is keeping their safety the #1 priority.
Great. Yeah, that sounds good. I actually am in my own office right now, and we have some of those steps in place with, QR codes you scan in and, some of those similar things. So I think that is great. Another question that came in was, and this is an interesting one. So a few years ago, the open concept or hoteling type workspace was the big hit, where some, companies were changing to, get more people in kind of that, some of us call it Q world, in a smaller scale with lower walls, or you have the hoteling space where you're sharing a desk, you don't have your own personal space. How do you think that type of office space or style is going to change with the new COVID, guidelines? Are some of those, companies going to have to, give designated desk areas, or what do you think might be changing with that trend?
Yeah, I think that's the $64 million question, is how will the workplace look different? And so, yes, you're right. We did go to a lot of more social collaboration spaces as opposed to fixed workstations, because we recognized that there was a better exchange of information and innovation when you afforded that. Now, obviously, you're not going to see all of that disappear entirely, but what we are looking at are things like different surface materials for those collaboration spaces so that they can be cleaned more effectively. But we're also thinking about how people can actually collaborate through technology. So, and how that might change is that the workplace becomes more a place where you interact in short bursts. And it's a destination that you interact in short bursts, and then you go back to your nest where you feel safe and secure to be able to do heads down work.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I know a lot of people might be, kind of thinking about that if they had one of those workspaces. So that is definitely great to see that people are thinking about it, and there's different ways that we can transition those without like a complete redo. So, and then let me see here. We've got a few more coming in. So give me just one moment and I'll check them out and get them out to you. Here's another big one on how do you manage the culture overall under this new norm? If gatherings are limited, obviously, which you've touched on a bit, we just talked about with the new, the spaces and how we use all of that. How are companies how should they try to not lose their sense of belonging and culture with trying to bring together everyone? And I know you've mentioned the piece on, maybe some sit and, do like a Teams or a Zoom while some are in spaces. Is that, how is the culture going to look, or how would people feel? Because while some might, feel included because they're sitting in the space with the 6 feet apart, how do you foresee, like with the ones that are on the Zooms or in their, just along those lines with the culture?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big challenge, and whoever figures that out is going to make a lot of money, I would say. But I think the reality is that you're going to have to engage the workforce to say, how do you want us to interact with you? I think this is definitely one of those topics that I think would make a great focus group or roundtable discussion within any organization, because what we're also seeing right now is we're trying to build that bridge and walk across it at the same time, right? And
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of trial and error. And if we engage our employees in having those discussions to say what works for you, I think that's a great start, because they're going to inform you. If you think about it, we've already experienced a lot of this dissonance in the past, because there are very different cultures within any one organization. And then you layer on that the generational value differences, and it already makes for a really nice potpourri of diversity. Now you layer on top of this, how do I still maintain a sense of connectedness? It's going to be interesting. We do a number of fun things. We do this game called Quiplash, and you can play it online, and it just brings people together. Escape rooms, they're virtual online escape rooms as well that are great. But I think for the most part, people want to know what the organization is doing, and in terms of aligning to the future needs of the business. And if you're communicating to keep the culture alive, I think the culture will be different. The culture that we left will no longer be the culture that we go back into. So for us to say, how do we keep the culture alive, while it's a good question, I think we need to say, how will the culture look different? And that's where we need to engage employees in helping us redefine that.
That's definitely a big one. And so I thank you for your commentary on that, because I'm sure there's a lot out there that are curious, getting back into spaces.
I'm not the expert here. This is just, my experience and how we think about change management, because this is by far going to be the biggest change management exercise that we've done, because it's not organizationally, it's how even different
Globally.
Companies work together as they return to the workplace.
Yes, yeah, that is big, because you have a lot of companies sometimes where you used to do a lot of interaction with, maybe I'm in construction, so I do have a lot of interaction with outside companies or trades and stuff like that. So it has definitely changed the world that I work in. So definitely, especially in the office place. And so then another, looks like we probably have time for one more question. And so this one is more related to managing. So I don't know how you guys are, or what you've seen for, the the piece on managing, if you're a manager level and you've got employees, some who are going to stay home just due to feeling comfortable or having kids and daycare and stuff like that. How do you recommend, or what have you seen from managers to help kind of guide them towards being able to manage people at home and people in the office, but not suffocate everyone, if you know what I'm saying, like, so that they don't feel like they're being micromanaged, or, and just making sure that your team is doing everything they're supposed to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we've been very lucky as an organization because we've already been in a distributed work, dispersed work, agile work arrangement for the last 6-7 years. So it wasn't too much of a leap for us because we typically pre-COVID had people working from home. But there are obviously managers who are still quite traditional and expect that, to have, to put it crudely, butts in seats, and that's how you're being productive. And so that wasn't too much of a change for us. But here are some recommendations. If you have a culture where you have one-on-ones, continue to have those one-on-ones, because those are opportunities for you to have one-on-one conversations with the individual about how are they feeling. When I have my one-on-ones with my team, I start with, how are you doing? Where's your head at? Because it does give them an opportunity to decompress. I think the other thing that we can consider as well is reviewing the performance goals. Many of us have had to pivot to work on projects that were on the back burner perhaps, or reshift priorities. So making sure that we're giving people the right direction so that they know that they're not spinning their wheels, and giving them the opportunity to present those to other people within the organization is also helpful. So skip level meetings to give exposure to a project that you're working on is helpful. And then asking the individual that you manage, what's your capacity? Where are you at in terms of your capacity? Because as many of us know, the skills that we're moving into are not role-based. Skills and roles are no longer intertwined. And so we've had to redistribute work as well to make sure that everyone has meaningful work.
Yeah, oh, great. Well, I think with that, I wanted to say thank you so much. I know we had some technical difficulties there getting in, but it all worked out, and I hope the weather's settling down for you over there.
I know.
So it's coming our way. So, but thank you again so much, Sharon, for spending the afternoon with us and doing this great presentation and Q&A. And on behalf of Crew Detroit, thank you. Everyone who is online participating right now, if you don't mind checking out the website, we've got some future things coming down the pipeline, so keep an eye on it there, and we will close out the session. So thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone.
Good afternoon. Thank you.